We're going to finish up where we started a little bit last week. We talked about the Laetoli footprints, and the Laetoli footprints were actually discovered by Mary Leakey. Everybody knows who the Leakeys are. They're probably the most prominent anthropologist in the world, and have been for years, that family. And what's interesting about these footprints is they look like human footprints. 1978, Mary Leakey discovered a series of what appeared to be human footprints at this site in North Tanzania. Now, I mentioned last week there's footprints that look very similar to human footprints here in the United States, in Glen Rose, Texas, except they can't get on them, they're private property. Those have not been studied extensively, which really concerns me. I don't understand that. They're there, and it's just chalked up that they have to be dinosaur prints that are misinterpreted as footprints. But if you look at them, they look like footprints. But the reasoning behind that is, well, humans weren't alive back then. So it's circular reasoning. You can't have human footprints at the same time you have dinosaur footprints, because dinosaurs predated humans, if you believe in evolution. Well, this is the same sort of thing. The difference is they have been extensively studied. And there seems to be no doubt that they look very human. That's sort of a picture. I mean, I guess if you can see it from back there, they do look very human. They're supposed to be 3.6 million years old. And Miss Leakey herself described them as remarkably similar to those of modern man. Remarkably similar. I'd say they are very similar. They look indistinguishable from modern man. That's how similar they are. There's about 69 of these footprints. And it's funny, wouldn't you expect more footprints? I don't know. We don't see that much. I guess it's hard to fossilize footprints, but nonetheless, these were there, and supposedly, again, 69 footprints from 3.6 million years and about 30 yards in length. And again, they were described as a Lucy-type hominid, or Australopithecus afarensis, which we studied, despite a striking appearance of modern humans. Why would they be ascribed to Australopithecus afarensis? Again, because of the supposed age. Nothing to do with the way the footprints look. It's all because the age is assumed to be 3.6 million years. Now, this is completely unprovable, and even more curious. Lucy, if you may recall, was very small. She was supposedly about 3 feet tall, 3.5 feet tall at the most. These footprints are the same size as a grown human. I mean, much taller person. So wouldn't you think they wouldn't belong to Lucy? Now, maybe Lucy was a variety of a smaller version of Australopithecus, I don't know. But these are normal size footprints. These are not footprints of a little child or someone who's 3 feet tall. So that's curious, isn't it? So Russell H. Tuttle of the University of Chicago studied these as well as many other people. And he postulated, well, maybe these are footprints of humans, and he went and looked at, or at least could be that of someone human type. And so he looked at the Machingua Indians in the mountains of Peru. These people run around barefooted. They don't wear shoes. He calls it habitually barefoot. Okay, and examining their footprints, he concluded that they look just like these. It says, in some of the 3.5 million year old footprints at Laetoli Site G resemble those of habitually unshod modern humans. They look exactly the same. None of their features suggest that the Laetoli hominids were less capable bipeds than we are. So why ascribe these footprints to humans? Why not? Why not ascribe these footprints to humans? Well, because that would mess up evolution. Interpreting the Laetoli footprints is not a question of scholarship. It's a question of logic and the basic rules of evidence. That's our friend Marvin Lubenow. And evolutionists will never call extremely old fossils by their proper names, because to do so would invalidate their theory. And these footprints are there, and again, they've been studied. But no evolutionist would ever say that these were human. Even Tuttle would not say that, because he said they can't be, they're too old, even though he's the one that says they look just like humans. I don't get it. All right, summing up our study on the fossils. The facts are fossils that are indistinguishable from modern humans can't be traced all the way back to as long as 4.5 million years. That's using their dating again, not mine, but their dating. According to the evolutionary timescale, humans were on the scene before Australopithecus appears in the fossil record. That's just a fact, unless you're an evolutionist and you're not going to interpret the facts. Bone structures, skull structures. Now we know footprints were there millions of years ago according to their time scale. So even when we accept the evolutionist dates for fossils, which I don't, the results do not support human evolution, period. Now, there's a solution to this if you're an evolutionist, because fossils aren't really that important. No, we don't need, we've said this before in this class, when we understand that the fossils don't, 150 years plus has gone by since Darwin published his book, right? What was Darwin looking for when he published his book? Fossil evidence for his theory. And he said, Darwin said, if the fossil evidence is there, there's nothing to support his theory. 150 years have gone by, that's a pretty long time. There's still not fossil evidence to support his theory. So you got Mark Ridley out of Oxford University saying no real evolutionists, whether gradualist or, I don't know what a real evolutionist is. You either are or you aren't, I don't know. Whether gradualists or punctuationists, you know what a punctuationist is, the one that needs punctuation evolution. None of those use the fossil record as evidence in favor of their theory as opposed to special creation. The evidence for evolution simply does not depend on the fossil record. So that's hedging your bet there. So it doesn't matter. So I guess if you believe that you need the fossil record, you're not a real evolutionist. That's what that would imply. So Darwin said again, the number of intermediate form fossilized in the records must be numerous, and if they are not found, their absence posed a serious dilemma to his theory. That's Darwin that said that. And this is a great way to end this thing. It must be the only theory ever put forth in the history of science that claims to be scientific, but then explains why evidence for it cannot be found. That's Marvin Lubenow. And that's just true. It supposedly is scientific, but yet the evidence isn't there, but we don't need it because it had to happen that way. So the human fossil evidence is in complete accord with the scripture, except for their dating methods. Okay? Now we're going to go to lesson 11. Lesson 11 deals with the concept of evolution and whether or not it is a racist theory or not. And that question has been posed basically since the beginning of the evolutionary debate. And Lubenow discusses it extensively in his book. So most of what I'm taking from, is from Bones of Contention from Marvin Lubenow. So is evolution a racist theory? Well, by its very nature, it's racist. Wouldn't you agree? By its very nature, it's racist. Because as species, quote unquote, evolve, the nature of the species is that by natural selection, you get improvement of the species. So by its very nature, each species that is superior to the other, it just lends itself to racism. That's just the truth. If you look at it from just a philosophical point of view. Darwin, no doubt, was racist. Okay? Now, that's not a put down on Darwin so much as it's a put down on the society in which he lived in. Well, Lubenow says 99% of the Europeans were racist. That's probably true at Darwin's time. His fellow Englishmen, the French, the Germans, they were all racist. They all believed in the superiority of the white race. And even the title of his book, if you look at the full title of the book, it's The Origins of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, Darwin used the word racist interchangeably with species, not necessarily just races of men, but there's no doubt that he believed that evolution would produce favored races. I don't think there's any doubt in his theory. So what is racism? We all know what racism is, whether you have an exact definition for it, but this comes from the Dictionary of Contemporary English from Longman, and it says racism is an unfair treatment of people or violence against them because they belong to a different race from your own, and the belief that different races of people have different characters and abilities, that your own race is the best. That is racism by definition. And of course we know racism has been practiced throughout human history, but it is certainly not condoned by the scriptures. The scriptures do not condone racism, never has, from a biblical perspective. The Bible clearly teaches that mankind was of one blood. And, there's not different bloods. We're all of the same blood, and there's scripture to support that. And although evolution is not the cause of racism, it was there a long time before the theory was espoused, it does give humans an allegedly scientific justification for it. It certainly did at Darwin's time. So as a result, past races were denied full humanity. When Darwin began his voyage on the Beagle, there was aboard that Beagle 3 savages from Tierra del Fuego. Now these were savages as described by Darwin. These savages had already been captured by our friend Mr. Fitzroy, Captain Fitzroy, on the Beagle before Darwin's voyage several years before. He had brought them back to England. And his purpose in doing that, it was sort of an altruistic purpose. It was a Christian purpose, actually. He brought them back to England to civilize them, to take them back so that they could teach Christianity to their fellow countrymen, the Fuegans. This is pictures of what they look like. I suppose some of them are the ones that Darwin encountered, that dressed up a little bit there, as you can see on the left, and what the more natives look like on the right. That was the purpose. So when Darwin encountered these people, he was encountering the Fuegans after they've been civilized. He hadn't seen them in their natural habitat. So when he got there, when they finally got to the tip of South America, and he encountered them, he wasn't ready for what he saw. He was unprepared to see them in their natural habitat. And when he saw them in their natural habitat, it just totally confused him and surprised him to no end. And this is a quote from Darwin, and this comes from The Descent of Men that Darwin wrote several years after his book, Origin of Species. And he says, it was without exception the most curious and interesting spectacle I'd ever beheld. I could not have believed how wide was the difference between savage and civilized man. It is greater than between a wild and domesticated animal, and as much as in man there is greater power of improvement. One can hardly make oneself believe that they were fellow creatures and inhabitants of the same world. That's how curious he found these people. And so there have been, I don't have to tell you this, you know this, but throughout society there's been horrible atrocities perpetuated on people, and to a large extent based upon the concept of racism. And I think racism that has its ultimate generation from the thoughts of evolution, from the belief in evolution. Because again, evolution at its basic core is racist. And one of the more unfortunate ones concerned the Tasmanian Aboriginals in the early 1800s. You ever heard of the Tasmanian daredevil? No, not daredevil, what do they call it? Yeah, Tasmanian devil, not daredevil. Okay, that comes, I guess, from the little tiny island of Tasmania. Well, there was Aboriginals there, and these people were very black people that lived on this tiny island, and apparently had been separated from the rest of humanity by several thousand years. And so they had lived there for a long time, isolated from the rest of the world. Well, as the conquest of the world occurred through the Europeans in the early 1800s, the English sailed down to the tip of Australia to Tasmania. There's a picture of the Tasmanians. So when they first got there, there was approximately 5,000 Aboriginals. And by as early as 1842, only 135 remained. What happened to the others? They killed them. They destroyed them. And this is what Darwin had to say about that. He mentions this episode in his book, The Descent of Man. He says, extinction follows chiefly from the competition of a tribe with tribe and race with race. When civilized nations come in contact with barbarians, the struggle is short. We can see that the cultivation of the land will be fatal in many ways to the savages, for they cannot or will not change their habits. Would you say that's more or less a racist comment? I would. I mean, that's pretty racist just in his comment, but it's probably actually true. I mean, look what happened to the American Indians here in our own country. You know, they're not extinct, but you know that's what happens when societies that have more power, that have more technology, encounter societies where they do not. And so as a result, the true Tasmanians don't exist anymore. There are no full-blooded Tasmanians. And you can read about the atrocities and how these people were butchered. I'm not going to go into that detail today, but they were rounded up almost like cattle and butchered in many cases. And so there's no full-blooded Tasmanians. They're a mixture of, and there are about 4,000 of this mixed race there. That's just one of several atrocities. I would include slavery as far as racism is concerned. You have to include slavery as racism. Slavery as practiced in the United States and in Western Europe was racist at the core. But I think it was also a product of evolutionary thought, even before evolution was written formally by Darwin. The thoughts were there, just like the Tasmanians. The Tasmanian Aboriginals, this was the early 1800s when all this occurred. On the Origin of Species was published again, you remember that date was 1859. So this was before that, but the thoughts of evolution were really there, the idea that one race was better than the other. That's an evolutionary thought to a large extent. And it was a product of evolutionary thought. And then when Darwin published his book, it even made it more palatable, if you will. That's what it did. Now, some in the name of Christianity have tried to condone the practice of slavery. The practice of slavery, as was practiced in the United States in the early 1700s and 1800s, I don't believe any Christian could condone that. I mean, it was uncivilized. What we did to people, what was done to people, was not Christian in any way, shape, or form. To say slavery as practiced in Europe in the American 19th century has scriptural basis, I believe, this is my opinion, is either complete ignorance of the scripture or ignorance of how slavery was practiced, one of the two. You've either got your scripture messed up or you've got how slavery was practiced here was done. It just cannot be condoned. I know slavery is mentioned in the Bible. I think that was a different type of slavery than we're dealing with here that occurred in Europe and in the United States. Luke says that man was made in the image of God. He says, let us make man in the image in our likeness. Genesis 1:26. Not Luke, did I say Luke? Genesis said that, sorry. I got ahead of myself. This is Luke from Acts. Luke, from one man he made every nation that they should inhabit the whole earth. We're all one nation. We're all one people. Does anybody not believe that in this class? I'm sure you do. The golden rule, as stated by Christ, is treat one's neighbor as oneself. Treating one's neighbor as itself doesn't include kidnapping, murder, torture, human enslavement. Clearly is not treating one's neighbor as oneself. And that's how slaves were captured and brought over here from Africa. And then when they got over here, frequently treated in the most inhumane manner. Apostles were given all authority of heaven and earth and were to go and make disciples of all nations. They weren't to be critical of one nation or the other. That would even include the Aboriginals in Tasmania or anywhere else for that matter. And in my opinion, all humanity constitutes these nations. So why would you treat someone horribly that you believe would be a fellow Christian or should be a fellow Christian? You would not. As Abraham Lincoln said back in the 1850s, if slavery isn't wrong, then nothing is, the way it was practiced here. The most egregious example. Now we're going to get into something that when I was a young boy, born in 1953, I remember this incident. Even though this was the early 1960s, I was old enough to remember this, and probably a lot of you in this class remember it well. And that's the Adolf Eichmann trial that took place. But in our lifetime, or not in our lifetime, some of our lifetime, but in our memory, the most egregious example of man's inhumanity, in my opinion, was the Holocaust perpetrated on Jews, Gypsies, nonconformists, and the mentally and physically disadvantaged that occurred in Nazi Germany, in Eastern Europe during World War II, primarily by Adolf Hitler and his minions. This is Adolf Eichmann. Y'all remember Adolf Eichmann? He was personally responsible, either directly or indirectly, for the death of about 5 million Jews. You know, he was kind of the head of the Holocaust, I guess you could call that, from Hitler. And he had absconded to Argentina, as a lot of the Nazis did. They came over here. Well, the Jews that were, Israel, founded, I think in 1947, right after the war, there was some Nazi hunters that eventually hunted him down and found him in Argentina. And so he was brought back to Israel for trial. This was again in 1960. And this comes from Lubanal as well. Dr. A.E. Wildersmith relates an incident concerning Eichmann when he was captured and in Israel. Before his hanging, a chaplain had come in and asked him if he would like to make a confession. Eichmann replied, "Confess? What have I got to confess? I've done nothing wrong." He didn't see anything wrong with what he had done. The chaplain then replied, "You've done nothing wrong. Do I understand you?" And yes, Eichmann replied, "I've done only right." And this is how he explained it. When the chaplain asked him to explain himself, Eichmann stated, "Both the churches of Germany, the Catholic and the Protestant, believe in theistic evolution. Both of them believe that God's method of creation was to wipe out the handicapped and wipe out the less fitted." That's survival of the fittest, isn't it? Natural selection. "And as the Jews are less fitted than our people, I have only helped God in his methods. I have only catalyzed God's way of working, and when I meet God, I shall tell him so." That's straight from Adolf Eichmann. What causes this kind of thought? I'll discuss that in a minute, but we just got back from France, Cherry and I, and when we were over there, I decided to travel to the beaches of Normandy. This is, I guess you know, what is it, the 70th anniversary of D-Day? A lot of stuff on the History Channel about that, and fascinating things. So I wanted to see the beaches of Normandy, and when we went through there, we went to a little city called Caen, and there was a war museum there that the French had put. And there was a lot of memorabilia there, but there was one poster that kind of took me, took me back a little bit. And I can only paraphrase what the poster, I can't remember exactly the wording on it. I'm going to show a poster that might have been the same poster, but one very similar in just a second. But the heading on the poster said something to the effect is, "Can we afford to continue to take care of people like this?" And what the poster was, it was an obviously mentally challenged, handicapped individual. He just looked that way, okay? And he was sitting in a chair. And behind him in that chair was, I think, a couple of nurses and someone who looked like a physician. He was in a doctor's white coat and so forth. And the document went on the poster went on to document how much money it was costing the state to keep that individual alive. They were spending a lot of money. That's what, again, this might have been the same poster, but I can't remember. It was similar. Cherry found this on the internet. I should have taken a picture of it, but I didn't. This is all in German, obviously. But the translation was 60,000 Reichmarks were used to keep this person alive on a yearly basis. What this person's suffering from is hereditary defects and it cost the people's community during his lifetime. Comrade, this is your money too. What was this poster trying to persuade the German people to do?
Justify euthanasia.
Right. It was to justify euthanasia. Exactly. The whole point was to make it where you could understand why we have to kill this person. And that's what they did. That's how they started. They started off killing the mentally challenged, the physically handicapped, the people that we do everything in our power in this country to try to keep alive and give them some quality of life. Someone once said, when a society will no longer take care of the most vulnerable individuals in that society, you have a society that has just really now reached the bottom of our depths. Well, guess what's happening in this country? The same thing. You know what we call it? Abortion. We call it something else, but we're doing the same thing for a different reason. And that's why in my paper, if you've read it or if you haven't, you'll see that I'll say that abortion is partly racist. What stirs that kind of thought? What is the mentality that allows that to happen? It's evolution. Because you put no value in human life. If we're all just human, we're all just animals, just a higher form of the animal, you put no value in that life. And that's what Hitler did. He put no value in life that he considered inferior, which included the mentally handicapped, the physically handicapped. It included Jews. It included gypsies. It included a lot of other people that were rounded up and killed. That's what this museum that went to kind of showed, amongst a lot of other things. But I believe it's at the core of evolution. And that's why it's justifiable now in our country to kill millions of unborn babies. And let me tell you, I think it's just around the corner. You may not agree with me on this, but it's just around the corner before euthanasia will be legalized in this country. And it is beginning to be legalized in other countries. But I think it's just around the corner. When you got some of these so-called philosophers and ethics people that think whose ethics is a totally different ethic than yours and mine, then you'll have justification for this kind of thing. The late Lubin said, this is kind of, I think, an interesting quote. Hitler was not a madman. People say he was a madman. He was a madman. Maybe he was a madman, but Lubin says he probably wasn't a madman, but he was a bad man. A really bad man. But he wasn't the only one there, obviously. This couldn't have happened by Hitler himself. That's the reason for that poster. Now, I don't think the German people knew everything that was going on at the time, but that poster was put out there for the public. And they knew the Jews were being rounded up like cattle. It's just hard for me to conceive how the Holocaust could have occurred while people sat by and let it happen. It just still does. I don't understand that. But it did. And it's still happening in other parts of the world even now. Stephen Jay Gould, he's dead now, and we talk about Stephen Jay Gould a little bit. He was at one time the most prominent evolutionist. Now I would say that's Richard Dawkins, but Stephen Jay Gould was there. He understood the implications of the theory. And Stephen recounts the story of the Dutch settlers who were shot and ate, the Dutch settlers who shot and ate African bushmen. And this is Stephen Jay Gould. The tragedy of this is that the history of scientific views, for the most part and until quite recently, on the subject of race, have supported this social and political notion that human groups are separated by profound and innate inequalities in intellectual abilities and moral behaviors. The justification of shooting and eating the African bushmen was evolution, based upon evolutionary theory, because they were treated nothing more than like animals, the bushmen were. Like orangutans, nothing more. Okay, in the 1960s, this comes from a Harvard-educated anthropologist, Carlton Kuhn, and he postulated the concept of 5 basic human races. I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but this was coming from an evolutionary anthropologist. The Caucasoid race, which is Caucasian, the Mongoloids, the Australocoids, the Capoids, and the Congoids. You can kind of figure out who these races were by just looking at the names, except for the fourth one, which is a little bit harder, but those are the Pygmies and Huguenots and people like that. He based this on the idea of multi-regionalism, that evolution occurred, but in different regions. So as evolution occurred multi-regionally, you would have these different races developing. That was his concept. Not the concept that we have, that human beings all came from the same blood. That's not what Kuhn believed. It's multi-regionalism. That concept is still out there, but is falling way out of favor because of its obvious racist implications. Kuhn believed that each one of these races developed separately into Homo sapiens, and their stock could be traced back to Homo erectus. His beliefs created quite a stir, as you might think, in the anthropologic and evolutionary circles, and the reason is because it allows for racism. Paleontologists have now developed another model to get away from racism. The whole point of this model that we're going to discuss these last 10 minutes here is because they want to get away from racism, because they don't want evolution to look racist, even though it's racist at its basic core. So that's what this is all about. So they've come up with another model. All living humans evolved from the very same human stock, all evolved in the same period, and thus the radical distinctions among humans today have a very shallow rather than a very deep history. And it started in Africa, and this is a graph, and it just sort of shows everything going every which way to South America and America, because people got here some way, didn't they? And we don't believe that the human race started in America. It probably started, where the Euphrates and Tigris River are. That's what the Bible says. So they were spread all over. But this is the out of Africa model, because the evolutionists believe that life began in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Neanderthal man was downgraded as a result of this, and he has no longer considered a precursor to modern man. Why would Neanderthal man be downgraded? Where did racism really have a large of its core start at? We just talked about it. Europe. Where was Neanderthal man? Europe. Neanderthal man is no longer part of human history. We've wiped him out. He's no longer part of human history. He died out. He's extinct. He's not here anymore. Ergo, we can get rid of that idea that Europe had a special place in history. That's all it's about. It has nothing to do with science. Really, it doesn't. Some have tried to use DNA studies as well as fossil records to prove this, and they postulate Homo erectus are archaic humans originally evolved in Africa from Homo habilis, or Australopithecus stock. Modern humans evolved in Africa stemming from Eve, probably Lucy, who lived in Africa 200,000 years ago. Modern humans have then migrated to Europe and Asia. These modern humans eliminated all other humans with little or no inbreeding, replacing Neanderthals in Europe and all other primitives. Africa thus became the birthplace of all humans. This cannot be supported by the fossil records. It just cannot be. It cannot be. However, in 1987, about 3 different Berkeley biochemists examined mitochondrial DNA, not of Eve, but of 136 living women. And we talked about mitochondrial DNA briefly last week. That supposedly only came from the female side, the woman's side. And they concluded by using at this computer-generated information of the mitochondrial DNA that the mother of all humanity lived in sub-Saharan Africa 200,000 years ago. They did this because that's what they wanted to prove. And again, a little graph showing that. I'm not going into detail there. So we've looked at this problem with computer-generated studies, haven't we, in this class? There's a problem when you use a computer a lot of times. And these are all computer-generated. The computer was designed to reveal a maximum parsimony phylogeny. The computer was given information and it was thus biased by the order in which the data was entered. Henry G. of Nature, not a creationist, has called this stuff garbage. Mark Stoneking of the Max Planck Institute of Evolutionary Anthropology, sounds like an evolutionist to me, of Leipzig, acknowledged that the African Eve model has been invalidated, and it involves circular reasoning to even use it to begin with. When looking at human DNA nucleotides, how does one know which ones are the results of mutation and which ones have remained unchanged? How do you know that? You can't know it unless you have started with the beginning, and that is that the chimpanzee was the beginning. So the evolutionist used as his guide the DNA of the chimpanzee. In other words, the studies that seek to prove that human DNA evolved from chimp DNA start with the assumption that the chimp DNA represents the original condition or close to it, from which human DNA diverged. And as Lubinau says, this is circular reasoning with a vengeance. These sophisticated computer programs are independently able to generate truth, but in reality they cannot. Don't buy into that nonsense. At this time, the African fossil evidence for African Eve is both a farce and questionable, Marvin Lubinau. And with each genetic study that claims to validate Eve conclusively, there comes an equal and opposite reaction showing the study's weakness. So as many studies as show its validity show its weakness. As we have seen, it's obvious that evolution is racist at its basic core. It is somewhat odd that the most racist theory ever to gain acceptance in the scientific community is now being given credit for proving human equality, because they don't want to be racist anymore, even though it's racist to the core. Human equality does not require proof. It's intrinsic to God's creation. We don't need to prove that we're equal. We know that as Christians.